Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our final webinar in our fall series on best practices and adaptations to pandemic-related impacts in the geosciences. I'm Leila Gonzalez, and I'll be moderating today's webinar with my colleague Luke Charbonneau. So in today's webinar, we'll be hearing from several geoscience employers on how their organizations have navigated pandemic-related challenges to maintain operational continuity, including how work environments and hiring and onboarding of new employees has changed as a result of the pandemic. This webinar is part of AGI's larger Geoscience COVID Impact Study, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. So our speakers today are Gail Blackmer, who is a state geologist and bureau director at the Pennsylvania Geological Survey, Mike Lawless, who is the principal regional growth leader at TRC Companies, Marie Pepler, who's the Bureau Emergency Management Coordinator in the Hazards Mission Area for the U.S. Geological Survey, Ray Talkington, who's the principal hydrogeologist and president of Geosphere Environmental Management. So thank you everyone for joining us, and I'd like to go ahead and jump into our first discussion question. So we'll field the discussion questions to the panel, and then after that, field any questions or comments from the audience. So what were the most significant challenges your organization faced during the pandemic? And Mike, I'm going to start with you and hand that off to you.
Okay, thank you. I would say the most significant challenge was communication, both internal communication and external communication with our clients. We were fortunate that in January of 2020, we had our IT department had moved our system totally into the cloud. So we had virtual desktops. So we were, from an electronic standpoint, we were able to communicate well. But just having everybody distant from one another and having clients that had different approaches to the pandemic required a lot of coordination up front before our field work could start.
Absolutely. Gail, what about for you?
Well, the first immediate challenge was to get everybody set up to work from home, and I have to say that state government moved more quickly than I ever thought was possible. We were fortunate because we already had some people with laptops, and then we had a computer lab where folks would come in to use it for teaching purposes. And that room was full of laptops also. And so we were kind of on that first day wildly distributing laptops to people. And then the word came down that people could take their desktops home. And I never thought that would happen. And so we just had, the dollies going down the hall with people's computers on them so that they could move them home. So that actually, there were a number of glitches setting that up, but that after a month or so, things got pretty well straightened out in that respect. And then I have to second the communications. Just maintaining communications between everyone when policies were changing, almost daily, and it was just very, very important to maintain those communications.
And Ray, how about for your company?
I don't think we worried too much about the communication part or the online part because we were already linked in and people could work from home already before all of this happened. So a real big thing is I kind of shut the office down for March, April, May, and people were going crazy because it was like, we need to be in touch with each other because we do a lot of field work. We coordinate with each other a lot. So by June of 2020, we were all back in the office, working from the office, still doing work with clients. So for us, it was a little different because we just didn't see or feel the need that we needed to work remotely. And those challengers weren't there for us. They were for a couple of months, but then it was just like, enough is enough, come back to the office. And people came back, worked as they did. One thing that we did do is we closed all our doors in our office, external doors, so no people could come in. But And still today, we have that the same way. You have to kind of make an appointment to come into the office.
Great. Marie, what about for where you work?
So, great. I'm excited to be here and talk about this because these are hard things and it's interesting to compare notes. Representing the federal government, we were sort of part of the bureaucratic ecosystem of rules. So some things we did on our own right away, communications, the bringing desktops home, we struggled with that as well. We had been on a trend toward laptops anyways. So that was great. We sort of were setting up for that. We just done a big cloud conversion in 2020. Apparently that was the thing to do in January 2020 because we just did the same thing. And kind of followed along in that. But in addition to sort of the same challenges, we also had the sort of federal bureaucracy, right? We weren't sort of allowed to set all of our own rules. There were a lot of lawyers, communications, both internally and externally, and we really struggled with that on the surface. USGS internally set the goal. Our leadership chose to say how that our goal was going to be zero employee to employee transmission. So that drove all of the rest of our planning and our guidance as best we could within the confines of the federal rules, which weren't quite CDC. They also had the lawyers involved, and we really struggled with sort of interpreting that. And then how do we roll that out to our employees? Department of Interior is incredibly diverse, right? We have the national park units, we have, energy production and Bureau of Reclamation. And then within USGS, we have some stuff that has to be conducted in person and some that really can be remote forever, right? Some researchers and statisticians, economists can be remote and are happy to be in their introverted selves. So we really struggled with sort of sorting out what our actual problems were. I'll say it was our biggest challenge in the beginning. And then at the end, it was sort of as we moved through the couple of years, it was sort of how do we put the pieces back together and figure out what is our future? What are we going to keep? What are we going to jettison? And I'll say identifying the problem in our diverse mission was a big challenge in the beginning for sure, in addition to communication, which was absolutely paramount. I'm so glad you started with that because then I got to add a little more nuance to it. Yeah.
So just following on to that, in terms of communication, how did you, as an organization, as managers, as, supervisors, how did you bridge that communication gap? What tools did you find most useful going forward? And what are you keeping as to tools and methods for keeping the communication channels open? I'm just going to throw that out there to everyone and see. Yeah.
I'll start, I guess. So we realized that the person that the actual individual trusts the most is their immediate supervisor or maybe one level manager up. So for us, it was very much how do we get the right information to the right level that then the employee takes the right action. This isn't anything novel. This is a pretty standard problem in communications. But in COVID, it was mentioned earlier, because everything was changing so fast, we had to keep that pace up. And so in the beginning, we were sending basically instructional emails every day, and that just got to be overwhelming. And we switched to a weekly digest email that became sort of our central location, and that got passed on throughout the organization and then adapted into the lower level rules. And that worked and was able to be sustained for 2 years. The other problem is in communications, what are people going to keep listening to when it lasts this long? It's not just a one hit thing or even a volcano that just lasts a couple of weeks, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, in an environmental consulting company with engineers and geologists and other scientists who don't communicate well anyway, when you throw in getting everybody remote and then trying to communicate, it is really a challenge. So we relied a lot on our section leaders, our project managers, to make sure they were reaching out to their staff either by email, phone, or video conference, at least daily, just to check in and make sure everybody knew what they were working on, were being productive, had the tools they needed. But initially, we really tried to over communicate. And then I think once people got comfortable with the remote work, we could scale that back.
Yeah, I would say that we did the same kind of thing in the state survey. Our group is relatively small. We have something like 30 people in our agency. But I was maintaining more communication with the managers and the supervisors. And then I would do a weekly email out to everybody so that I made sure that everybody in the agency heard from me at least once a week. Um, and but we had to be more intentional, because we were used to obviously finding people in the hallway, right? If we needed to talk. So it was putting all those meetings on the calendar. So if you wanted to check in with somebody, you had to set up a meeting to do that. And that for me at least was a big shift because I'm not used to my calendar looking like that. Right. I'm just used to getting up from my desk and finding whoever I need to talk to. But we had to be really, really more intentional during that time. And we've kept some of that.
I think that's true for all of us, that the amount of communication we have with individuals was a lot greater, a lot more frequent. Um, but in our case, it only lasted, a couple of months, and then we were back in the office, and it was back to the way we normally communicate. So we had a much smaller time period in which we had to ramp up the type of communication that we had than most everyone else in really large organizations or state or federal government organizations, which are really driven by lawyers, a lot of stuff, and which is what we don't want, but it is. That's the reality of the world.
Yeah.
Great, thanks for the comments there. So, following on from that, what strategies, we already talked about communication strategies, but what other strategies has your organization implemented during the pandemic to maintain that operational continuity? I know, Ray, you talked about everybody pretty much came back and business as normal after a short period of time. But what other strategies did you find useful to keep things going while situations were changing?
Yeah, I think sort of internally, it really didn't change very much. What did change is how we communicate with the outside world. And that became either through Zoom or Team. That became a platform that was used almost every day, communicating with people, because a lot of places and people that we work with, their places are in a lockdown. And even though you can communicate with them, they may not be in their office anymore. They may be at their house. A lot of the regulators that we would deal with, they're at home, and even to this day, they're at home, and they said, we're never going back to our offices. We don't have to. So they work from their homes. And they say we're actually more productive working from home than being in an office with a lot of distractions, as we all know exist. So it really was communicating in a different way, not only by telephone, but by video conferencing with lots of different platforms to lots of different people.
I think for us, a lot of our projects are regulatory requirements for complying with environmental regulations. Those deadlines didn't go away. So our field staff had sampling schedules and remediation schedules that they had to adhere to. So I think from the field standpoint, it was pretty easy to maintain that continuity because we had deadlines we had to meet. With the more office-based staff, the challenge was to figure out who was being productive and who wasn't being productive, because when you're sitting at home in your living room, there are some people that can be very productive in that atmosphere, others cannot.
Mhm.
So it was trying to work with those individuals on an individual basis enough ahead of their deadlines so that if there was a problem, you could get them some additional assistance to meet the deadline. So again, a lot of it came down to communication. And once we got familiar with the video conferencing, that helped quite a bit.
Do you want to go? You want me to go?
Marie.
Okay, so I this is a really big question for us at the USGS, right? We're a big organization. I don't know if I said it right, but 10,000 people with a hugely diverse mission. And we essentially came up with different guidance and different strategies for each part of our organization for all of the specialized work we do. One of the things that I'm quite proud of is that we only missed one one perishable event, right? We were unable to measure one flood in the city of New York that was literally in March 2020 when the city was on lockdown, right? You got a ticket if you left your house. And so the mechanics of how to move our staff around in emergency situations needed to be worked out. And we did figure that out within a few weeks. But some of those things took a lot longer. You know, how do we bring people back in a laboratory that has unique venting needs for safety, right? Needs different hoods and different safety situations. How do we handle people on long-term vessel voyages? You know, do we pre-quarantine people and then put them all on the boat together? And then how do we keep those boats healthy when they're at sea for a couple of months, right? With remote and austere conditions. And how do our most common thing that we have in the survey is probably we joked and said it's 2 people in a truck. How do we solve the 2 people in a truck's problem? Because we always want 2 to 3 people out in any situation for safety reasons. And we want to minimize the amount we're driving because driving is actually an incredibly dangerous activity. But 2 people giving each other COVID in a car is incredibly likely. So we did a lot of car rentals and personal vehicle and extra miles driven, but there were times where we, voluntarily employees volunteered to kind of pod together so that they could put 2 people in a truck and accept that additional risk for transmission of COVID. Our biggest issue, of course, was we didn't want people moving around and then coming back and giving it to a whole group of people and shutting down an office. That happened a lot to other groups in the Department of the Interior. You know, you have one staff meeting and suddenly an entire national park has to shut down because there's nobody to run it, nobody to maintain it, nobody to, honestly, cleaning bathrooms was a huge issue for the Park Service, right? And it's these sort of little things that sort of built up a lot when it comes to operational continuity. How do we keep the job going? So it took a lot of individual and specialized guidance, and some of it we have kept. I'll note too, I think that was the other thing we were supposed to kind of talk about is what are we keeping? So, you know, stay home for a few days after you go to a conference is something that has actually really stuck for us. As conferences has moved back to being in person, don't bring germs back to your office because now we're sort of doing the hybrid mix. Some people are coming in a few days a week, some aren't. We're saying just don't come in, don't share whatever you might be incubating in whatever you're doing. And that's been really helpful just in the last year as we're sort of trying to figure out our hybrid environment. But our strategies, this is such a huge list. I mean, we had a massive SharePoint site, which guidance that kind of hit on everything you could possibly think of. Yeah. So I struggled with how I was going to answer this question since we got the questions in advance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Marie brings up a good point in terms of, going away to conferences and then sort of like self-quarantining. I personally, and even the people in the office, we've kind of stopped going to conferences simply for that reason. It's just like, you know what? Is it really necessary for us to go to this? Or is it going to be, put on a Zoom or a Team or some sort of electronic platform or what? And so we're personally just almost cut 100% going away to conferences simply for that reason.
Well, and I think there's a flip side to that, right? Like we lose something, especially the early career staff who don't have as strong of networks. We lose something by not going to conferences and not getting that exposure, not to germs, but to each other and the research and stuff. So that's something that we've been discussing, right? We really have not started going back to conferences en masse, but AGU is next week, and that's going to be a big thing. You know, how are we going to attend? How much is the risk worth it or not? And especially for early and mid-career people, they really want to attend those conferences, but there's no good answer. Yeah.
I'll chime in a little bit. we in terms of strategies on the logistical side, there were a lot of IT solutions. So we were sort of creeping onto OneDrive, and so that process really accelerated. And now, of course, we're all on OneDrive. And we had to learn how to do that. Our GIS people had to learn how to do that because ArcGIS does not play well with OneDrive. So that was another stage in working out, how do you do that, especially when it got to the point where we were moving back and forth, so that they might have a laptop at home and they might be working on their desktop in the office still. So, but we worked all that out. We had a lot of trouble in the beginning getting a VPN that actually worked, right? Because that was the other solution, right? If you're doing GIS work, then you have to remote into your desktop. So there was a lot of trouble with those connections in the beginning. We finally got a better solution. The IT folks came up with a better vendor, and that's very stable now, and we do that all the time. We bought some MiFi units to send home with people because we had people who live in places where they don't get good Wi-Fi, or they didn't have it. There's still a few people out there who don't have, FiOS or something. So we had to buy a few devices to send home with people, but we got all that worked out. The other thing that happened to us was, talked about going in the field. The state of Pennsylvania said that we weren't allowed to do that for like the first 6 months, right? Nobody gets in the car. It wasn't how do you get in the car? It was you don't get in the car. And like the whole state was shut down, so you couldn't really travel around. And there was a lot of conversation between the state geological surveys about what our individual situations were, because we all had state map grants. We had mapping deliverables that had to go into the USGS, right? And we were not able to finish up the field work. And so we sort of figured out internally what we needed, and we talked to the folks in the National Cooperative Geologic Mapping Program office, and we worked out compromises with them, and basically they were able to arrange to push back the deliverable dates. So we got extensions on all of those grants, and I think, worked through all the weirdness of the overlapping extensions now. So we're sort of back on a regular schedule. But that was a big effort, again, communications and compromise. So it was working between the states and then with the USGS and the program office to get all that straightened out.
No, Gail, you reminded me that was a huge thing, was deciding what was important enough to do, right? So for us, we call those mission essential functions. But you're right, geologic mapping, those deadlines all got slid because we sort of as a society decided that thing was not worth the risk, right? But there were other things that were. And so our guidance, what I was discussing were for those things that we decided were, but the haves and the have-nots definitely appeared too. And I think everybody sort of did this. What's worth the risk of doing that? Because we had to have letters from the Attorney General to be able to go out to do field work. And you're like, this is ridiculous. This is our day job, right? And I just, honestly, I think I had like blocked that until you said it. And I was like, oh. And I agree, huge advances in the computational modeling and the sharing for things that we never used to be able to do remotely. Now we figured all that out, and that was great. Yeah.
One of the challenges that we had at the time, we were a company of about 375 people, and about a third of those worked in the field the majority of the time, and the rest were office staff. And so it set up some internal friction when the field staff was really operating business as usual, and they saw the office staff staying at home and working from home in their pajamas and all that. So there were some of those internal communication that we needed to do to kind of make sure that everybody continued to be focused on the products we were producing for our clients and not get caught up in, who's doing what and not doing what in the company.
Yeah. Yeah, we saw that same thing, and the stress that it brings internally on teams, like, is, I don't know if we talk about mental health. I think that's one of the later questions, but like that's been massive. Like the stress of what's happening here and what's happening there and who's required to do what when, bunny slippers or boots are what we joked that it was. Yep. And I think that's ongoing. And for what it's worth, I think that hasn't, we're still working on figuring that out. The people that have to come in to come into the lab, they have to commute. They have different childcare needs. They have different pressures on themselves, right? Whether you're in a job that is allowed to telework or really can't telework. And I think we're seeing that as a society. So I got totally off this discussion question, but I think it's an important one to remember that as employers and as employees, we have this sort of constant dance now about what can be done from where and why. Like explaining why are you the one that has to do this work versus someone else? Because I am high risk, child with special needs, or I personally have a disability, right? All that has to play into our decisions. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's go ahead and move on to the next question. So this kind of segues off of what we were just talking about, looking at lasting changes to your work environment. And, I know in our COVID survey, so we've been doing a longitudinal survey since May of 2020, and we just wrapped up with the last survey this past week. But definitely have seen some shifts in work environments towards a more flexible, responsive work environment so that learning and workplaces can continue on. And now there's that flexibility and more comfortableness with working remote. So you can switch from one mode to the other as things change. And so for your organizations, what lasting changes are you seeing going forward as a result of, multiple years of COVID? How has that really changed things permanently for your organizations?
Well, for us, we are on a permanent hybrid work schedule now. We've got some people come into the office every day. Some will be in the office 3 days a week, some 2 days a week. But we do have people continuing to work at home at least a few days a week. I think that's the most major change that we've had, because prior to that, people would only work at home on very rare occasions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
go ahead.
our situation is the same. The state has a permanent telework option now, and the agencies were allowed to customize that. So in our agency, which is the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, we decided that employees can telework up to 50% of the time, and they get to choose. They don't have to. And so we have a few people here in the survey who don't telework because they didn't like to stay home. They didn't need to stay home. The guy who runs the lab downstairs kind of needs to come in. And there are a few people who telework 1 day a week. Most people are on the 50%. But we intentionally had people set their schedules so that nobody teleworks on Tuesdays. So that means, you can still take leave or be in the field. But that means that Tuesdays people are in the office. And that gives everybody that opportunity to touch and talk and, interact, that people are going to be there. And that's worked out really well. And it took a while, but many of us have realized that we don't get much done on our to-do lists on Tuesdays because we have to talk. But that's part of working also. And, we're scientists, and you can't really do effective science, in a hole somewhere. So, so the mappers need to talk to the other mappers, and they need to talk to the GIS folks, and you just need that interaction. So I think that that's worked out well. You can have that time when you're working at home to do things that you have to really concentrate on, and then when you're in the office, you have that more opportunity to talk to people. So that, I think, that's the biggest change. Plus all the, the ongoing virtual meetings and conferences and opportunities to talk and meet with folks that you wouldn't have been able to do when all of our meetings were in person. I can't go out to Denver every 2 weeks, but I can have a call with somebody who's in Denver. Right? So that's an important change too.
I think one of the important things for us, we haven't changed too much other than the way we communicate with the outside world. But one of the things that's important is, and why it's good to have the people in the office, and we touched on it a little bit earlier, is mentoring the younger staff, because when they come out of school, they think they know everything, and that's okay. They're book smart, but the real world is out here, and we need to help them. We need to introduce them to lots of things that they may have never been introduced to when they were in school. So here you go. So we have to be there. We cannot just say, "Oh, go ahead and figure it out yourself." Well, they can maybe do it, but is it the correct way? Is it the way that you want it? So you need to be there to mentor them, to be there, to go out in the field with them, or to sit next to them while they're working on something, whether it's a data analysis, whether they're graphing something, whether they're trying to understand, why do we see this drawdown in this well, blah, 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 all sort of stuff like that, whatever it may be. So it's good that we're there to do that. So I think it's important that we are there for them. And I think, if you could do that one day a week, Gail, you just sit down with them and, just be their mentor, be there. You're cemented to them. Here we go. Let's do this. That's really, really important. Because I think if you just do completely remote and you with inexperienced or not many years experienced staff, you're gonna see that in a few years that it's gonna take its toll, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree that, I think we're at the start of a shift, and I think that we're going to see how it actually turns out 2 to 5 years from now, right? Like, we don't know if this is actually going to work or not, in my opinion. But that's my opinion. Now, so Department of Interior and kind of the federal government at large, some groups had remote work options. Department of Interior did not. We got a policy though about, I'd say maybe 18 months ago now, and then worked through implementation. And then it's a 1-year provisional period to see if remote work works. And so we're right now just coming up on that 1-year mark for some people who have approved remote work, which is different. And we've got a lot of hybrid telework issues. And I think that everything that you guys said is what we're seeing set up for the different size work groups. They're establishing a day a week that everyone comes in the office to try to level things out and provide that face-to-face mentoring, and kind of make it a little bit easier with the, boots to bunny slippers. Everybody has to put their boots on 1 day a week, and come into the office. But there are some groups that have really thrived fully remote and have not only found themselves more productive, like you said, Gail, about, that you can have a meeting with someone, virtually in Denver, I think is really important. We found a big equality part of things kick in here, which was unexpected for us. So in my immediate team, right, we're about 40 in my mission area. And we had about 20 of us were in one location, and the other 20, there were maybe 5 or 6 in another location. And then everybody else was kind of spread out to different USGS offices, kind of co-located. And our staff meetings were pretty brutal, right? Because you had 20 people in a room all talking, and then you had the awkward people on the conference phone, right? This is pre-video lines, right? This is 2019 era. And we struggled with sort of are you in the room or are you not in the room? And what we found was immediately, as soon as we started conducting staff meetings with everybody at home, suddenly we were all equal in our video boxes. And it really was a lovely shift. And we've seen some offices, even as they're returning to in-person, still keeping their all hands meetings virtual with everybody in their separate offices in the building, still attending with the separate video boxes. And I think that's really important to remember, that when you have this hybrid mix, that there's in the room and not in the room, and that needs to be accounted for long term. And we've seen some real lasting changes in how we recruit and how we can handle recruiting in the federal government. So all of our stuff goes through USA Staffing. It's very, very structured. But sort of how we can say, do you have to come into the office? What's the workspace needs? Can we recruit better by asking for remote people that don't have to be co-located sitting right next to me? I think it makes a big difference in our fields, that we can have some sort of a mix. But for us, a big advantage that people have been talking about is that then you can downsize your office and hotel and slide everything in. But a lot of people forget that leases are like forever, right? And I learned this recently, the federal government, the typical GSA lease is 30 to 50 years on office space. Not that we can't get out of it or adjust it or rearrange it, but like that's how we lock things in the federal government. We're kind of real long term. So like, oh, let's everybody work from home, but come in one day and we'll totally rework our work environment. Just functionally, that honestly doesn't work for us in the USGS or for many areas. So it's like when your workspace is coming up or when you're moving, you can adjust those sorts of things. So we have a lot of space where people are still coming in to offices and rearranging. So I think a lot of the things that some groups can do, federal government can't. So we're looking at kind of the long-term workplaces themselves actually aren't changing, but how we use them is definitely changing, and how we kind of can shift around. And I hope we keep it flexible. I think it's been a positive thing overall, and much more equal with the conference room. I saw something fly through the chat that somebody was agreeing with me at some point, but I didn't catch it.
I mean, I just want to touch on one thing that we spoke to a little bit before. You know, one of my other hats is, I do teach at the university, and once they went to strictly online, in the online platform, which we all had to learn the different platforms. Lita can attest to that, because I was after her, like, how do I do this? How do I do this? So, but I would get notices once or twice a week from the administration saying that student XYZ is having mental health problems with being online and being remote. And I thought this was like, really, like, this is kind of strange. But then I reached out to other folks, and they said, no, it's about 25% of the undergraduate, in this case, population is struggling with remoteness, not being able to be within a group. I don't know how that's going to translate into going into industry or going into government when they have to work there. If they have to work remotely, that could be a real struggle, and I'm not sure how we address that yet.
No, I think that's really important though. And we've seen it too. Like, we just can't check in on people the same way we could when you were in person, right? We only see so much of our body language. And I think that's really a really critical point. Like, so I think part of it can be mentoring, making sure people are connected, talking to people every day on video and doing that. But I think it's something we don't have the answer for yet either.
We don't either, and I've spoken to some of the students since the school's largely gone back to on in-person teaching. They said the dynamics within the university are very changed, and the students don't congregate together. They're all sort of like maybe tiny groups or no groups at all. They're all looking at their iPads or phones or something. But the interaction that you used to see pre-COVID doesn't exist anymore, at least in this one campus. Sad, but how do we deal with it? But then that's going to translate coming to all of us here. How does that translate to us when they do come here? And what are going to be their expectations when they're looking for a job? Is it going to be all remote? Is it going to be, I don't want to go to an office, I just want to work remote? Or
Mhm.
I want to come to an office because I cannot work remote?
Some great points there, Ray.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Layla, we do have a question in the chat. The question is from Joseph Hinton. He says, I work in a career development space at a community college. What kind of advice would you like to see us giving students about entering the workforce in today's more hybrid environment?
That's great. And I'm going to throw that out there because I know we're going to touch on that on the next slide. So let me advance to our next slide and then we'll field Joseph's question. So any comments from anyone?
Yeah, the biggest thing I would say is be flexible, maintain flexibility, because um, a lot of the companies' policies are still evolving as we're coming out of the pandemic and getting back to normal. Now we've also got flu season to deal with, and so people are all worried about that. So I think flexibility is huge. The other thing is, Ray mentioned that mentoring was very difficult when you're remote. I mean, it's very difficult to do effectively. So I would say as students are coming into the workforce now, it's going to be more critical than ever for them to show initiative to get mentored, ask questions, look for guidance, because I think a lot of the mentors that they'll find in the workplace may have adopted some bad habits during remote work where they're not as aggressively mentoring staff. So I think if the students can come out and force that mentorship a little bit, I think that will help them advance their careers.
Well, and I think I totally agree with everything you said, that it has to sort of be part of and it comes with the onboarding, right? So we onboarded people remotely. We FedEx you a laptop, tell you to drive to a credentialing center to get your card activated or whatever. And then we'd sort of like check in every so often. It takes a lot more proactiveness on the supervisor's point. And I think for the new employees and the students, how do they kind of push at that? And I think I want to say that USGS is similar to a lot of the geologic sciences, that we may not have the most outgoing and people-driven personalities. I'm trying to have the delicate way to say, like, we're a bunch of introverts who only want to stare at our own shoes, right? And for some people, the video process has been the right level of boundary, right? Like, oh, I'm not, I don't actually have to be in the room with you. I can kind of just be here with you for like an hour, and that's much more palatable. For others, it's more draining to have to be on video and be like on, as opposed to it's easier to kind of just meet someone for coffee, for an hour. And I think that in my opinion, my personal opinion, that this has to be much more personal. It can't just be sort of like, here's the mentoring guidance. You meet with someone once a month and here's the process, right? You have to really know what type of supervisor you are, what type of person that is. And so my advice in answering the question is sort of coach the new students, the individuals, to figure out what they need and then advocate for that. So I am a people person. I need to be in person more on that side, right? Because the flexibility of the policy is evolving. We've got some fluidity, some wiggle room. Or I'm the type of person that needs to just talk for an hour and then be left alone. Or I need things in writing and agendas as opposed to verbally and thrown out there. And I think that leads to more success. Like that sort of personalization that comes with the more options, right? If your only choice was to show up in an office 5 days a week, that's your only choice. The personalization choices aren't there. But I think that as we have more flexibility, we have to know what we need and what other people need in order to be able to help that. So I'd encourage the new employees and the students to pay attention to that for themselves and be ready to advocate for what they need. I had an intern over the pandemic who was just kind of like in and out for 1 year in the last 3. And when he started, he was like, I really want to come in. I'm brand new out of school. I need all this in-office interaction. But by the end of his year, when he was applying for jobs, he was like, absolutely not. I'm only applying for fully remote jobs. I don't want to deal with any of that. He'd completely flipped. And it was an interesting evolution to sort of watch and work through with him. So I think that flexibility is key, and knowing what works. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Marie, but how do you pick leaders? How do you develop leaders in situations like that? When things,
Yeah.
I just want to be remote. Like, well, wait a minute. What's happened to the leaders? Who wants to be the manager? Who wants to move up? How do you define those? How do you find those if they just work remote? Well, maybe they've
Yeah.
excluded themselves from it.
Yeah, and I think that depends on the person, right? And the group. I think you know, like I talked about, right? So then when half of the group is in the office and half of the group is scattered, there's a natural sort of mixing there in not the whole group, and that's a struggle. But when everyone's sort of more flexible, it works. Plus, I was really just referring to entry level for sure. Leadership development, I think, is another corner entirely.
Huge, yes.
Yeah, and huge and really challenging to figure out, but that's going to be, you know, a little bit later than sort of the onboarding piece. Yeah.
Agreed.
I think that there are things that you learn in your first job that have nothing to do with the technical aspects of your job. So you learn time management. You learn how to work on a team. All these sort of, I guess they're kind of social aspects of being a professional. And
Oh,
those,
office etiquette.
yeah,
We
and
have people who have
those,
no office etiquette at all. Yeah.
so those things, I think are harder to pick up in a fully remote environment. So I would think, well, you have to be, you know, more in control. You have to be more self-motivated, right? Because your supervisor's not going to be looking over your shoulder all the time, telling you what to do. So you're, to a certain extent, going to have to figure out this new job that you've never done anything like this before, kind of on your own. So I think that the students have to be more self-aware, right, about what they need. And I would suggest that a student not go into a fully remote or a position as their first position, that they go for a job where people are in the office or that's a hybrid, because I think you need that interaction with the more experienced professionals at work.
Agreed.
That's just my opinion. We really haven't hired anybody. We've done a ton of hiring. We have actually turned over about 30% of our staff from retirements, right? Over the course of the pandemic. But really only one of those people was a real entry level, you know, just out of school position. So I'm not necessarily speaking firsthand. I'm speaking from what I think about what people need.
It's also been a little bit challenging, even with some of the more senior employees, because of the new hires. When you're onboarding them remotely and then starting them to work the majority of the time remotely, it's hard to build relationships. And so therefore it becomes hard to make them feel part of the team. So it's easier for them to drift away. And we hired a lot of people during the pandemic, probably 75 people. And I would say of those, maybe 50% left the company just because we were not able to really develop those relationships and make them part of the team. So that was a big challenge.
And we've had to
We-
find ways, you know, now we're sort of back together, right? So
Right.
it's easier now, you know, because we're in and out of the office now. But we had to find ways to kind of get people together safely, right? So like you have a section meeting at a state park where you can all sit in the pavilion outside, right? Or you bring people.
Yeah.
We have spaces in our building that are big enough that we can bring people in, but have them be, you know, 6 feet apart or whatever. So, you know, if you're going to have a bunch of people in the room, everybody wore a mask, you know, but we found some ways to get folks into face-to-face situations. And our new people we have a really good group here. So, maybe it doesn't work everywhere, but we've been able to really incorporate all of those new people pretty effectively.
Wait,
I think that's where
can I
the
ask-
field work. Go ahead.
I want to ask you a question, Michael. So for the half that stayed of your new hires, do you think you did anything different?
That's a really good question. I think they're probably the ones that stayed were a higher proportion of field staff. So they did have face-to-face contact with others out in the field. That was, I don't know that we did anything differently among the groups. So I think the field aspect was big because there you're outside, you're able to work with others and develop those relationships. I think that was probably one of the bigger factors. The other, on the flip side, the job market is just so competitive right now that a lot of people aren't staying anywhere very long. They're all bouncing around.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for the feedback. I want to throw a question out there. I know the discussion questions about how hiring and onboarding of new employees have been affected, but I also wanted to kind of focus this more on, some of the input we've received from surveys, and I know discussions with employers is that finding new talent has been difficult before the pandemic, but especially during and continuing on to now, finding new talent to fill those new positions. So one question I had was, it's going to be a two-part question. The first is your organization experiencing that? And then two, with talent hard to find, what strategies do you use? Do you hire outside the discipline? Maybe you're looking for more analytical data analysis credentials and then backfill with geologic knowledge. Is that one approach, or how would you handle that if your organization is experiencing that kind of talent gap for new positions?
Yeah, I would say for us, it's as difficult as it's ever been to find new talent. It was hard before the pandemic because there are less people going into science and engineering, but now it's even worse. And we started out the pandemic in March of 2020 as a 380 person firm based in Virginia and North Carolina. 2 years later, we were acquired by TRC. Now we're part of a global firm of 7,000 people. So we now have our own in-house recruiters to help with finding talent. We had hoped that being part of a larger company would allow us in Virginia to pull some of that talent in our direction. But what we found was all the offices are short-staffed. Nobody can find talent. So now we're just a bigger company with less talent or less available talent. But I think a lot of it really comes down to networking. If you can build a network and you identify people at conferences that look like they might be a fit for your company, then that'll kind of give you a leg up. Just advertising and recruiter phone calls are not very successful.
Agree with that. It's just like it's all word of mouth to find people using all these search engines or Indeed and all those platforms. It never worked. We may get people from other countries trying to apply, but you need some local knowledge. So it's very, very, very difficult. We've even gone to the point where some of our people have gone into various stores to buy things, and someone says, "Oh, you work for so and so," and next thing you know, they send a resume to us. And one guy was actually a bartender, but he had done a degree in psychology, but he had dissected rat brains, so he knew how to put together a thesis and do science. And we said, we're going to take a flyer on this person, even though he has no geological or hydrogeological knowledge. We took him and trained him, and he became an incredibly super employee that was extremely talented. So sometimes you do have to take the flyer and you do have to try someone else, but you have to be there to mentor them too. But usually those people are pretty self-motivated and they want to learn, and they turn out to be incredibly great employees. So yeah, we've done that.
I'm going to pass on this question because I don't get to pick any of that in the federal government. So different problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in the same situation. We have
Right.
a lot of rules about
It was
who
like-
we can recruit and hire.
Oh, exactly. I was like, recruiters in Virginia? Wait a second. Yeah, no.
Great, thanks. We got time for just one more question. I think John wants to ask it, so I'm going to go ahead and allow his mic. So John, go ahead and unmute. You should be able to.
Lila, thank you. Just make it very quick. Michigan Geologic Survey hasn't been funded for 30 years, and so we did receive annual funding right now, $3 million a year, and we put out a national announcement for the first 4 positions. But the thing that I find that is needed is we need to be doing outreach, not just to the schools, the middle schools, high schools, into the colleges, because we need to talk about what the need is so that people start focusing on the disciplines that they need to take in order to get those jobs. And they're not low-paying jobs; they're adequately paying jobs. So that's what I've been doing for a year and a half here. And so I just put the announcement out 2 days ago, and I already have 2 applications in 2 of the positions, and I hope to get more. But the whole point is that we have to do outreach to the universities and go talk to them and do more talking and get them to meetings. For whatever reason, people don't want to come to meetings. Anyway, that's where the networking goes. That's my comment.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, John.
And I think to John's point, it's, I've reached out to the universities in the Boston area where I am, and for the faculty that I know, I said, look, I'm looking for this type of person. And it's amazing how quickly a resume comes to you, or 2 or 3 or 4 resumes, and you just look at them. So they are out there, but it's really the networking, the word of mouth, and knowing the faculty members at these universities. And not all of them, because some of the ones I go to, I know what the faculty are like. I know how they train the students, and those are the ones that I will look at for recruiting purposes.
Another quick plug for the students out there. There are many jobs that require professional licensure as a professional geologist. And if you don't have a geology degree that includes the right courses, you cannot get a license. So that's something to think about when you're arranging your courses.
And to piggyback on that, take the fundamentals exam as soon as you can after you
Yeah.
graduate before
Yeah.
you forget it all.
Absolutely. Speaking as someone who took it well into her career.
Right.
Well, great. Thank you, everybody. That's about all we have time for today. I'd like to thank each and every one of you, Mike, Ray, Gail, and Marie, for taking the time to share your insights with us. It's been a great discussion. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate the comments in the chat from everyone. So if you have any questions that were not addressed today, you can always email them to webinars@americangeosciences.org. We've got that listed here on this slide, and we'll make sure to pass your questions along to the panelists. And we will, just as a reminder, be posting the recording of today's webinar on our webinar webpage within about a week, and then we'll notify everyone as soon as that's available. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. So thank you again. Bye-bye.